living on wild and free.
Welcome to the shack, my preferred home away from home. As you can tell, I like to keep a real clean ship. Definitely lots of room to move around, and especially when I catch a big fish, there's tons of room to just deal with that fish. I mean, it definitely doesn't just flip water and slime everywhere and just bang against all my stuff. That doesn't happen. Okay, get it out of your mind. That definitely does happen. But this is the way I like to keep it. Uh, I like to spend most of my time fishing rather than organizing and cleaning, as you can tell. So, um, in this video, I kind of want to do more of like a podcast style video on a subject that I think is really important, but very rarely do I ever hear it talked about. And if it is, it's not very well discussed, and just how important it really is. And that is catch and release mortality, meaning when a fish is released, what is the likelihood that that fish will die? And you would be surprised. I'll put the percentage of it. I believe it's around 30% of fish that are caught and released will die. I could be wrong, but I'll put it up. I'll put the actual number up on the screen. Um, that is controlled by so many different variables, like could be the age of the fish. It could be it could be down to the individual, like an older fish, a fish that's been swimming hard, fighting. It could be a fish that came from deep water into shallow water. It could be the temperature of the water. It could be so many different things. So many that a lot of those variables are out of the fisherman's control. And so those are important factors to think about to keep into the equation of the likelihood of that mortality of that fish. Because if you're like me, I don't mind keeping fish. I'll keep fish to eat. I love a good fish taco. I love some smoked trout. I've kept fish on this trip. But for me, the majority, almost all of the fish that I catch are released. And I do that in the hopes that they'll survive and they'll reproduce, they'll grow bigger, other people will catch them, so on and so forth. Um, I got a fish on the graph right now. I got to reel up. I got to reel up. Oh, he's swimming away. Come on back. Anyways, um, now I'm getting all distracted here. Uh, so there are two factors that I want to talk about that are easily controlled by the fishermen, and I think dramatically increase the likelihood that that fish will survive. One is the time of fight. So the longer a fish fights, the longer it takes for you to get that fish up the hole or into the net, uh, dramatically increases its likelihood that it will not survive. You can imagine a fish that's fighting is like you running a marathon, doing a, ultimate fighting, a fight of just, high intensity workout. I mean, that fish is literally fighting for its life. If it is exerting incredible amounts of energy, and then you can imagine, you're running a marathon and then you dunk your head into water right after that. It's not quite the same. Fish can breathe in air, like it's just a much slower exchange of oxygen. So it's not quite the same as like dunking your head into water, but it is very similar to that. And so, the longer that fish is fighting, the longer it's exerting itself, the more it's going to be drained as you bring it out of that water, and you're taking the hook out, you're taking pictures, so on and so forth. Um, that is dramatically increasing its likelihood that it will not survive. You put it back into the water, it might kick away, but there's so many different now it's extremely stressed. It might be exhausted. It might not be. It might need days to recover if it survives. During that time, it might starve. It might become even more weak, or it might just not even have enough life, and it might not have enough energy to even exert itself to swim anymore, and it just floats to the surface and dies. So, fight time is so important to keep that minimized as much as possible. And the way to do that is to use the correct gear. So for me, I'm targeting 20-pound plus lake trout. So I have a heavy rod and I'm using 50-pound braid with 30-pound fluoro, right? Even for a 40-pound fish, this is the correct setup. Now, is it going to kick my butt? Absolutely. Is it going to be a long fight time? Absolutely. But I can bring it in within a reasonable amount of time, and also keeping in mind the duration of time that it's out of water after that fight is so critical. But we won't discuss that in this video, but it's just something to think about. But it could be anything. I mean, if you're out catching small perch, having an ultralight rod is just fine, but it's using the correct gear that is appropriate for the species and the size of fish that you want to catch. Now, I might be targeting 20-pound lake trout, but I'm also catching 2-pound lake trout, 5-pound lake trout. This gear, it's not very fun to catch those fish on, but I don't downsize just on that chance that when I do catch that 20-pounder, I have the correct gear, right? So that's huge. Something to think about. Minimize the amount of fight because that will dramatically decrease. Actually, no, it'd be the other way around. It would dramatically, if you minimize the amount of fight time, it'll dramatically increase the likelihood that that fish will survive after you release it. And now, the second part, it is water depth. A lot of fish are very sensitive to changes in pressure, right? If say a walleye is down 30 feet below the water surface, the pressure is much greater than at the surface. So you catch that walleye at 30 feet of water, you bring it up. That's a huge variance in uh, pressure. And there's a couple of things that happen to the fish when that happens, but the biggest is what's called barotrauma, and it's an expansion of their air bladder. And for those that might not know, fish have a organ that runs along their spine that can fill or contract with air depending on pressures. And what that air bladder does is just keep them upright. So that's actually what keeps them uh, upright in the water, and that change in pressure, so going from 30 feet to the water surface is massive. And that bladder cannot adjust that quickly. It can over time, but not that quickly. It takes hours and hours and hours for an air bladder to fully adjust to different, like that huge of a pressure gradient. Um, so when you bring that walleye up, it's now way too full of air. It sometimes they'll actually be spitting out that air bladder, like, you'll actually be able to see it in their mouth, and, it's very destructive. Now the fish is fully alive. It's probably in incredible amounts of pain, but who knows? I mean, reptiles, cold-blooded species, it's theorized that they seem to feel pain differently than, mammals do, but who knows? It's not good either way. I mean, it can't be good. It'd be like literally if your lungs just like expanded 3, 4 times their normal size. I mean, that caused a tremendous amount of distress. And now it also, you take the hook out of its mouth, you throw it back into the water, it can kick off. But if it doesn't have enough energy to push itself, like, it'd be literally like, you thinking, like Jaws, right? Where they have the barrels connected to the rope and the shark's trying to pull it down. It's kind of a similar thing to that, right? They're trying to push against all of that air that's in their body to get back down to the bottom. Sometimes they can. Sometimes, again, if you're using the correct amount of gear, you bring them up quickly to the surface, you release them quickly, they have enough energy that they can push themselves back down to the depths, everything readjusts, and their likelihood of mortality decreases dramatically. Now, what typically happens is they come up to the surface, they try to kick off. So you see them just swim away. You're like, perfect, clean release, but they can't quite make it. They don't have enough energy to push themselves back down to the depths that they need. Um, and they will come back up to the surface and they typically die at the water surface. Typically unbeknownst to the fisherman, right? So you don't even realize that that fish has died. So there's all kinds of different um, levels of water depth. That's the maximum water depth that, as you get deeper below that water depth, um, uh, uh, the likelihood of that species of fish is it goes up dramatically, right? Um, Like, for instance, there are some species that can actually burp air. They can actually expel air through their mouth very quickly so that they can adjust their air bladder, within seconds. And those species are like trout, whitefish, cisco. They can actually swim up and down the water column. That if you're fighting them and you're bringing them up through the water column, they're expelling air to readjust, and then they can fill that air back up as they need, fairly quickly. The filling up takes a little bit more time, but they can expel that air very quickly as they reach, up to the surface. Uh, so those species are adapted for that. That's not really a concern for those species, but a lot of species like northern pike, walleye, burbot, perch, sunfish, crappies, those are all species that cannot do that. They actually absorb that, uh, additional air through their bloodstream, so they can't burp it. It's going through their bloodstream, which takes a very long time. And so even if you delay the fighting period, but again, if we delay the fighting period, then we're also increasing mortality risk. Um, Even then, it will still take too long. It takes hours for them to adjust to that level extreme. So just a rule of thumb, it's right around 30 feet. Above 30 feet, the likelihood of mortality dramatically goes down. Below 30 feet, so deeper than 30 feet, the likelihood of mortality dramatically goes up. So it's just something to think about. If you're out at a walleye spot, you're at 25 feet of water, you're right at that zone, right? And it's just something to think about that that fish needs to come up quickly and it needs to go back down quickly. And if it doesn't, the likelihood of the mortality goes way up. Now, the bigger the fish, typically, the less likely that they're not going to be able to push themselves off and get themselves back down to deeper water. But again, it all depends on, amount of fight time. The more exhausted that they are, the less likely that they're going to be able to push off and get back down to deeper water. And so that's really it. And those two variables, um, eh, dra- dramatically see, it's hard when you're talking about this stuff because there's so many different variables that do control mortality rates. But in general, that is a rule of thumb that longer fight times and right around that 30-foot mark, depending on the species, of course, I just want to give a simple rule. I'm starting to get lost in the weeds because I'm like, well, a burbot actually it's, more like 50 feet and blah, blah, but that's just a general rule of thumb to think about, to consider when you're out fishing. If you're finding that the walleye are out super deep, that's okay. You bring them up to the surface, you kill them, and then you eat them. That's, something to consider, right? But if you're planning on catching and releasing those walleye at 35, 40 feet of water, that's not happening. Those walleye are more than likely not going to make it down to the depths that they need to readjust their air bladder. Um, so stuff to think about. I really appreciate you watching all the way to the end. I mean, education, information, that's what changes fisheries. That's what um, continues conservation efforts to increase population size. That it's not just if the fish swims away that it's okay. There are chances that that fish will not survive. So educate yourself. Thank you for watching. Please share this video with others that you may think that this information could help them increase the likelihood that that fish survives. And as always, keep living high, wild, and free. Where are all the fish? Ugh.